Well, I want to introduce Tabitha to you. I have a little information that I gathered from her. She graduated from Tarleton State University with a business degree, and she is currently working on her master's degree in developmental psychology, specializing in child and adolescent development. You know, I used to think, because our daughter Abby works with adolescents, you have to be really gifted to work with that age group, because that's when the hormones are racing and it's like, oh, they don't know who they are. Yeah, and you've got to try to figure that out as a teacher. Wow. And she is passionate in her work as an advocate for at-risk youth and their families. She's a teacher in the Connolly school system, teaching 2nd grade. She has twin boys who are 19 years old and has been loving Jesus for 10 years. Tabitha has a testimony to share with us. She recently published her first book entitled My Innocence Was Stolen. And she published it to raise awareness and to help others find their way back from tragedy. So I will let her tell her story. Come on up. You can come up here or you can sit down, whatever you're comfortable
Okay.
with.
I'm not real used to talking on a mic. Can y'all hear me without the mic? You need the mic. Okay. So, as she said, I am a teacher. I met Carla when I fell into the field of education, and I didn't plan on being in the field of education. It just kind of happened by accident. I was a single mom, and I was really going through some hard times with my boys who were facing a lot of at-risk behavior. And I, of course, cried out to God, and I was like, I hate my job where I'm at, and I don't have enough time. And so then it was put on my heart to apply at Waco ISD, and that's how all that happened. I also didn't know I was a writer. I didn't know I was an advocate. I didn't know anything except I was trying to piece my life back together after I was a social work major, and I was 2 semesters away from finishing that degree and was told I couldn't get funding. And that's where I had to come back full circle and face my story that I'm about to share. So it's kind of crazy how things work out. So I was born into poverty. I was born into a divided and abusive family. My mom was adopted by the family that were her main abusers. It was normalized, and so the word abuse or the term trauma, it never resonated until I started working in education. Anyway, I grew up in government housing. We didn't have a lot of money, so I was surrounded by kids that had better advantages than I did, and I was a minority. You would think that with me being Caucasian, I would be surrounded by more, but I wasn't. I was the minority. And so I was teased and picked on. I was bullied because of the clothes that I wore, because of my mom not having enough money to provide what the other kids had. They had the name brand shoes, the name brand clothes. I was a toddler when my mom found me and my sibling doing inappropriate things, and I didn't know anything different than what we were introduced to. Obviously, my brother, there was something going on with him, and so the cries for help began at a very young age. And instead of somebody reaching out and trying to fix that, my mom ended up having mental breakdowns and sent my brother to live with a well-known abuser in the family. And so the abuse didn't stop there. My grandfather, who is my dad's dad, continued to abuse me and my brother, emotionally, verbally, physically, sexually. And this went on until I was probably about 8 or 9 years old, when I finally realized that I'm not like normal people, and this wasn't right. And so that's when I went to my mom and I shared the things that were going on. And she knew. I mean, that's why my brother was living with my grandfather. She thought that he needed a male role model instead of her. And so she still had a life to keep up with, and she ran to the bars often. And that's where she took me with, because we lived right across the street from the bars. So that was what my exposure was as a kid. Well, instead of having the mother, the nurturer, the lover of caring for me as a mother should, she checked out mentally and checked herself into a mental institution because she tried to commit suicide. So 8 or 9 years old, I was waiting on my mother to pick me up from school, and I walk out and she's not there. I still try to think back on how did adults, I was going to Alta Vista, out of all schools, she used to work there. So we lived in the government housing that was down the street from Alta Vista. And so I ended up walking home that day. And when I got home, I was surprised by 2 CPS caseworkers who told me who they were. They had their little badges on, and they said that I had to go with them because my mother was in the hospital. So me trying to make sense of all that was hard. So they took me into the Methodist Children's Home. There was a emergency shelter, and I stayed there for about a month. And then they transferred me to a foster family that was outside of Waco. And all I remember is walking the streets with the lady that the adopted daughter, and we just loved being out in nature. And even to this day, I still love nature. Like, I just feel so connected. And that's kind of what kept me grounded. But then I was moved immediately from that home. I don't know why. I don't remember. They moved me back to another foster family. And the reason I'm sharing that is because that foster family stayed in my life, I chase rabbits sometimes, so you have to go with it. But anyway, so I stayed with that family for about 6 months, and they introduced me to Jesus, and they told me if I didn't believe in Jesus, I would burn in hell. And so that was why I got baptized, because I was afraid. I didn't want to burn in hell. But again, I was a little girl trying to make sense of my world. And so that was right before I started smoking cigarettes. Looking back now at some documents, at 10 years old, I was clinically diagnosed with depression and anxiety, so they put me on psychiatric drugs. So things continued on with my mom. She continued to get worse. She was diagnosed, instead of somebody looking into her trauma, she was diagnosed with schizophrenia and bipolar, so I dealt with a mother that was very mentally unstable. And instead of her raising me, I was raising us. And so behavior, my cries for help, which a child that has behavior, that is their cry for help because they don't know how to articulate things, started. And that's when I started running the streets, and I was that at-risk kid. And I was placed in special education, diagnosed with emotional disturbances, oppositional defiant disorder, the list goes on. And when I finally couldn't function in a classroom, they moved me to a juvenile school, which I still don't understand how they skipped alternative. I didn't think I was that bad, but so they put me with boot camp instructors, and that was wild because I had to walk to school every day. My mom blamed everything on me. So instead of, having mercy and compassion, again, I'm stuck with raising myself and having to walk to school. And the exposure that I was exposed there was more abuse. Of course, they don't see it that way, but they thought yelling and screaming and cussing and making us do drilling, physical training, working out, would change the behavior. All it did was make me more angry. And I resented any kind of male figure in my life. And so I became more defiant. And juvenile, when you go into that kind of school, the juvenile system takes over, and then you have a probation officer. So I had a probation officer, and they drug tested me, and they threatened me, well, you're going to end up in TYC, and that's a kid's prison if you don't know what that is. And so my whole life was fear-driven. It was fear-driven into Jesus. It was fear-driven into get your act together, behave. But I didn't know how to cope with the life that I was born into. So as I continued, my mental health continued to decline, and things got worse. I was in and out of mental institutions as an adolescent, and my juvenile probation officer said, we're going to move you to a girls' home. And of course, I didn't want to go because that means I had to give up smoking, and I have to give up hanging out with the friends, the quote-unquote friends. And so I didn't have a choice in it, and they moved me. And that was another traumatic experience because the girls that they placed me in the home with, they were gang-related girls that came from the valley. So I was constantly exposed to all this fear and anxiety. And if you know anything about development, a child's brain develops from the bottom up. And so instead of having that secure safety in my own home, or where I was taken from, I didn't have that. And so I constantly felt like I was living on the edge. Anxiety, they call it panic attacks. And that didn't last long because they closed down immediately. And so then I was transferred to the juvenile runaway shelter, and that's where I stayed for another month. It's kind of crazy how it kind of goes back and forth with CPS and now juvenile. So then they moved me to another placement outside of Waco. And all I remember is them asking me or telling me that I need to take my meds to modify my behavior. I couldn't start out in a regular school. I had to go to an alternative school. Nothing was normal in my life growing up. Nothing, absolutely nothing. They made us go to church. It was a Presbyterian home. So the pastor would stand outside in his gear, and he would smoke his cigarettes, and then he would get ready to go up and preach. And so every exposure that I had to Christianity was like the world. And so I didn't believe that anything about this Jesus, except he must really hate me, because, I mean, what kind of life does a child have to go through to have that, you know? So anyway, I stayed there about a month. In order to cope with things, I taught myself how to swim. I taught myself how to dive. I just found ways to kind of escape, you know, fantasy, you know, just trying to make sense of everything in your mind. So when I came back from that home, my grandfather was in my life. My mom had cut ties with me because she said I was abusive. It was the other way around, but of course I'm a child and I didn't know anything different. And we just had a toxic relationship. So, and I resented her because I always wanted a mother that just would love me and take me out on outings and have pedicures and manicures. And but I didn't have that normal life. So juvenile probation, they decided that I was getting somewhat well, so they sent me back to Waco, which is my hometown, to live with my grandfather, not the one who sexually abused me, but my mom's dad. And by then I'm 17 years old. My emotions are so deregulated. I've been on medication since I was 10. They put me in a private school, and they thought, oh, this will fix her. Well, that was more trauma because if you've ever seen the movie Mean Girls, that's my experience. Like, the girls were skinny. They had the cheerleading bodies. They were the popular ones. They drove the Trans Ams and the Firebirds and the Mustangs, and I drove this old beat-up Thunderbird. You know, so I never measured up. And I found out quickly that I never measured up. They made it known, and there was only 6 in my class, so I was the sore thumb. I was the outcast. So I thought I would try to give it a chance, even though I had that kind of exposure. There was a younger girl that was a grade lower than me. We became friends. We used to go run the valley together. And, of course, I was the at-risk kid, so everybody was scared to let me around their kids. And I remember that mom being that way. She's like, you know, you really shouldn't be hanging out with her. We both had our cars, so we snuck around anyways, and we hung out with each other. So then a younger guy, a grade lower, asked me to go to the prom. Mind you, throughout all of this, I didn't think I was worthy enough to even dress feminine, and so I shopped in the men's section. I wore the polo-style shirts, the jeans. So when he asked me to go to the prom, I thought, this is my opportunity to dress like a girl and get a dress. And so my grandfather took me, and we went shopping, and I got this really pretty dress and got some shoes, and I was getting really excited, and then he dumped me. He said he's going to go with somebody else. Well, I couldn't show up to the prom with the other mean girls. And so I checked out, and I hooked back up with the, when I was younger, there were older men that I was introduced to some very rough lifestyles, drugs, alcohol, trafficking, you name it, all of that. And they were teachers, coaches, postmen, you know, well-respected men of our community. And so that I thought it was okay. It's okay to do these things because they have it all together, so why not? You know, so I fell into that, and I ran the streets for the next several years. And then I got pregnant. And then I faced homelessness, and it was just, I could not function in society. I'm only giving you the short version, by the way. So I got pregnant when I was 18. They told me I was pregnant with twins. The same foster family that housed me for 6 months, they continued to stay in my life, but they were not as healthy as they presented themselves to be, and they tried to sell me to an illegal immigrant. They told me it would be good because then I could get money and get off the street. And so I almost did. I almost married this man, twice my age, an illegal immigrant fleeing his country illegally. So, long story short, somehow a divine intervention came in, and I didn't marry him, but I continued to do things that I had no business doing. I wasn't healthy while I was pregnant. I gave birth to the twins. They were 5 weeks early. CPS came into the life. The same caseworkers that, or not caseworkers, but the same system that failed me as a child, they came in and they said, well, we had word that you were doing drugs during your pregnancy, so we need to run all these tests and stuff. And I thought, and so everything was cleared after that. But then I got home and I really wanted to get my life together. I looked at my boys and I thought they deserve better. I've got to be better. But I couldn't get better because I didn't have the life skills. I didn't have the tools that I needed. So I continued that cycle, the same dysfunctional cycle that I witnessed growing up. I was in and out of mental institutions. I was running the streets. I was going to bars. I was doing drugs. I wasn't the steady mom that they needed. My emotions weren't regulated. There was a lot of rage and anger. So CPS 2 years later came in and they said, well, we can't have this. We're gonna ask you to leave the home. And so I had to leave my home with my kids, and they stayed with my grandfather. Mind you, they let my mother, one of my main abusers, have unsupervised visitations, and that used to just fire me up. And so I continued that vicious cycle, that poor me kind of thing, and I just continued to stay in the cycle of dysfunction and of drug use and, taken advantage of by men, and it was just awful. So a couple of years of doing that, instead of taking me to a mental to get me the help that I need, we ended up in jail a lot. So I went to jail, and I stayed in there for like 3 weeks. I was on suicide watch. They had me in this it looked like a bulletproof dress. I mean, it was, and then I used, toilet paper as my pillow, and it was awful. And I thought to myself, I don't ever want to come back here. Like, something's got to give. And so I'm angry at this God. Like, I'm like, if you really are real, like, you got to show me something. And I had been exposed to AA and NA, and I'm not bashing that. But when you tell somebody they have a disease, that to the core sends that message that something's wrong with you. And so my whole life I thought there's something wrong with me. So I started going back to NA, AA, because I wanted to look good for the courts, and I wanted to get out of trouble. And when I started going, this man that I actually lived with his ex-wife and her daughter, his stepdaughter, which is his son's, anyway. Well, he started giving me these books from Joyce Meyer, Battlefield of the Mind, Root of Rejection. And for the first time, somebody Christian, that they followed Jesus, they actually spoke my language, and they spoke a message of hope. And so when I realized that there's somebody that gets me, that understands not just me to the core, but to the thought patterns, and I just related with her. And little by little, my life started coming back into order. I started, keeping myself busy, going to school, going to work, finding a steady job, because I couldn't even hold a steady job. And about a year of that, I got my own place, and I asked my boy, which me and my boys were always close, and they didn't really know anything different. They just knew that Mama was sick. And so they were probably about 8. No, they were younger, about 6, 7. I asked them if they were ready to come home. And it really shocked me, because they were like, yes, I want to come home. And I thought, these little boys like me, and I'm an unlikable person. But it was God using them to show me his unconditional love. So I started just, gaining this relationship with this Jesus that ill-taught religion told me about. And I wasn't worthless, and there is hope for somebody like me. And so I was going to school, I was working, finally held down my longest job, and then everything came crashing down when I couldn't finish the social work program. Made the dean's list twice, and I still couldn't get help. And then I lost my job. And that's when I had to face everything. And I didn't realize I had never faced anything. I thought, well, I'm just good. But you have to go in through an internal cleansing and a healing. And I didn't know that I needed that. I just thought I was good. But when he calls you deeper, he calls you deeper. And so that I spent years, I battled depression, anxiety. I had people that were friends that were nurses, and they suggested me getting on psych meds. And I said, I've been on meds since I'm 10 years old. I don't want any part of that. And so I learned through the renewal of my mind, because he tells us, We are not to be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of our mind. And he just started doing a work in me, and just a supernatural. And then life started kind of coming somewhat together, and I stumbled into education. I had just got the documents from my childhood. I received over 1,700 documents from CPS. So for 8 years, they knew that I had been in an unsafe environment. They documented for 5 of those years that the unsafe environment interfered with my overall functioning. And so I just started tracing all these documents, school documents, juvenile, all these records that were just like, my community, they knew this. And so when I fell into education and I saw my story repeating itself, and I'm watching this unfold, and she could tell you story after story, and I'm watching this, and I'm trying not to take offense, but it's very personal because I just had to clean this mess up. So I was reading the book of Esther, and I was, at that time, everybody was encouraging me, you should become a teacher. You're really good at what you do. And so I thought, well, I'm going to be a teacher. That's what I'm going to do, because I was still trying to figure out what I wanted to do in my life. And so I was like, I went to God one summer, and I said, what do I do? And he's like, just, take a leap of faith. I'm the God of the impossible. And so I ended up paying for my own college tuition as a single mom. And it was a journey that taught me a lot. But through that process, I was also reading the book of Esther when he said, lay your life down and go public with your story. And I thought, no, I work at a school. Like, that's not going to happen. But, when he tells you to do it, there's no peace. And so I did it. And in 2017, Waco Trib published my story. Now, mind you, I thought I had all the support by my Christian fellow people that went to school. And when they saw my story, it was no longer encouragement. It was, how can we keep her out of here? Because now I'm exposing things. Because I'm holding these systems accountable for these families, for these kids. Because I'm like, if y'all can't work together for the greater good, then what good is it if we sit here and tell somebody about Jesus? Because we're not healing that brokenness. We're not bringing that restoration. And so I was confused because I had Christians telling me, we work within a public school system. It doesn't involve public attention. And I'm just like, wow, like that is just so sad to me. I would like to say that my life got better, but it didn't. And I went through another season where I didn't know what my future looked like. But out of obedience in 2019, I filed unemployment. That's how bad it got. And it was right before the pandemic. And I said, okay, God, what now? I did what you asked me to do. And he said to finish what I started. And so I did. And within 2 weeks, I wrote my first book. I didn't know I was a writer. So, when he just tells you to do something, he just gives you the resources and we do it. And so in 2019, my book was published. And I would like to say that I still have somewhat of support, but I don't. Because even in my community, it's a topic that nobody wants to really touch. Because if we do, we're exposing other people's dysfunction that don't want it exposed. And that's not the heart of God. So I've been before legislators. My goal is to go before Congress and the U.S. Supreme Court, because we're going to have somebody higher up to hold authority over this to make something happen, because I still engage with a lot of women in my community that come from stories like mine. And me being a teacher, that's another story, that's another testimony. But I didn't even think I was going to continue teaching because they literally try to destroy my livelihood. They try to destroy everything. And so I'm still, like that song says, breakthrough. I was like, I need a breakthrough because I'm really struggling. Like, I have a righteous anger about that because I'm watching these families continue that cycle that took me so long to get out of. And if it wasn't for the gospel, not the ill-taught religion, but the true living word of God, I would not be here today. And so that is my testimony in a short version. And that's where I'm at today.